Welcome everybody to our second installment of Central America, Diaspora, History, and Solidarity with Roberto Lovato, author of Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas. This event is sponsored by the Intercollegiate Department of Chicanx Latinx Studies, the Pomona College WIG Teaching Innovation Grant. Thank you to our chair, Gilda Ochoa, and to the Teaching and Learning Committee at Pitzer College, as well as my field group at Pitzer, the CHLT field group. So we're excited to have Roberto Lovato here. Professor Arely Zimmerman wrote a very beautiful biography about Roberto Lovato, but as I was saying to Roberto earlier, I actually remember Roberto Lovato because before I became a professor, I was an organizer in LA, and he was on my list of people to call when we were doing actions. We had an action list at the Korean Kiwa, and then also at Chirla, and then at SEIU and HRE Local 11. So when you become an organizer, if you're lucky, you inherit these lists from the previous organizers, or someone gives you a list, or you make up your own list. Well, I inherited one that had Roberto Lovato as my contact. And it said there, Carecen Cisan as my contact. And so when we were having actions, mostly around, we'd call folks on it. So that's how I first came in contact with Roberto Lovato, who's an educator, a journalist, and a writer based at the Writers Grotto in San Francisco, a recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center. Lovato has reported on the drug war, violence, terrorism in Mexico, Venezuela, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Haiti, France, and the United States, and also Honduras. I don't know why Honduras is not here. He's held a fellowship at the UC Berkeley's Latinx Research Center and has taught at UCLA, and is the co-founder of the first Central American Studies program in the country at Cal State University Northridge. And most recently, Roberto joined authors Miriam Gurba and David Bowles in co-founding #Dignidad Literaria, the movement advocating for equity and literary justice for more than 60 million Latinx persons left off the bookshelves of the United States and out of the national dialogue. So without much ado, I'm going to turn it over to Roberto. Thanks for being here.
Sorry. Thank you, Suyapa, for inviting me, for bringing this all together using your organizing talent of over many years, despite your youth, to organize so many people. I resent the fact that you're copying me by wearing red, and that you are also exposing me for being a total flake, because I don't think I returned your call when you called me that first time. So, ante Dios y toda la gente, perdónenme por mis pecados. I'm really excited to be with you and students of Pitzer and any other guests who are joining us right now. I really am encouraged and animated by the interest in the work that is the first one of our books in the English language written by and about Central Americanos in the US. It's nonfiction and published by one of the big 5 publishers, HarperCollins. So I'm loving the interest in the work, and I'm here to encourage others and to incite others to write their own stories.
Thank you so much.
Do you want me to read something?
I kind of wanted you to start out, maybe reading an excerpt from the book, and then we can launch into question and answer.
Okay. Well, one of the any book of like a memoir like mine, of nonfiction work, is going to have a lot of different motives, a lot of different reasons for writing it. So one of the major reasons for me writing my book is to do it as an act of what's known as memoria histórica. I don't know if your students have been introduced to the concept, but in case they haven't, I just want to summarize and say that memoria histórica is kind of a Latin American and also Spanish practice, because after the Spanish Civil War, there was a lot of talk about memoria histórica, which basically is the recovery of memory in order to pursue justice, right? It's not just remembering things, but it's memory so that you do the things that help facilitate different forms of justice, whether in courts, whether in the court of personal relations, like even in a family. Like I feel like I did some justice in my family because of all the silences that are there. And what I do in the book is to try to connect the personal silence and the personal justice to the political silence and the justice that we have to bring to countries, not just El Salvador, but to the United States. So I'm going to read a chapter that, and one of the things you want to do in Memoria Histórica is also just raise up people that are forgotten in traditional history. So I start off telling the story of my family, including my father and my abuelita, and the people that they grew up with. My father grew up in what's known as a mesón, a shanty town of, tin shacks, sometimes that are very large in the case of my father's upbringing. And the shanty town in San Salvador, where my father grew up in the 1930s during a Great Depression that made John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath look like a pizza festival or something. Um, you know, um, he grew up with basically a small town of prostitutes in the shanty town of sex workers. And so I'm going to share a little bit of the story of one of those sex workers who was an indigenous woman. And in the early 1930s, there was something called La Matanza, speaking of historical memory, that basically wiped out an estimated 10 to 30,000 people in January of 1932 in what is one of, according to scholars at Oxford, like Anders Sandberg, one of the single most violent episodes, not just in Latin American history, but in world history, in terms of the numbers of people killed in a specific place in such a short time. And so being indigenous, most of those people were indigenous. And most of that massacre, La Matanza, was forgotten. And so indigenous people had to leave the countryside to the city. So that's the context for the story I'm about to share. And so we're in the shanty town with my abuelita. My father's in the shanty town with my abuelita, and my abuelita's with this woman. Anita, a friend of Mama Te's, my grandmother, wasn't a puta de lista, one of the more than 2,000 prostitutes who were registered with the government. The putas de lista were subjected to regular checkup on the orders of El General, who used his alleged concern about hygiene in conjunction with more openly repressive measures, such as jailing prostitutes and giving them especially harsh and violent penalties for stealing and other crimes, all taken under cover of law and order, a concern for cleaning up society. Anita was a puta de 5 pesos, a 5-peso prostitute, and was afflicted with lymphogranuloma venereum, a venereal disease with symptoms that included enormously enlarged groin and underarm lymph nodes, forcing the afflicted to walk around with their arms spread wide like the swallow described in the Gardel hit La Golondrina. Like Ramon, Anita Villeda loved Te's ability to make scraps of fabric come to life. As one of the poor women working in one of the most marginal lines of work in one of the poorest parts of El Salvador, a country in the throes of the hemisphere's worst of the Great Depression, Anita appreciated the storied, toothless, and funny seamstress's finas atenciones, the delicate warmth with which they listened to, advised, and cared for her. Anita and other prostitutes bore the brunt of daily hardship in El Salvador in the 1930s. Malaria, infectious parasites, and other sometimes mortal afflictions. The bodies and faces of some of the prostitutes also had bruises and scars from injuries inflicted by the police, military, and the Mesón men who retained their services. Outside the Mesón, like Eve with her apple, Anita and the other prostitutes were blamed as a source of, quote, immoral vices of uncultured classes, and were denounced in the pulpits, newspapers, and salons of San Salvador. On top of everything else, Anita Villeda bore an extra liability, dark skin, and with it the burden of being indigenous at a time when it was mortally dangerous. Anita had migrated from Nahuizalco to San Salvador, where he had stopped speaking Nahuatl and exchanged her traditional indigenous clothing for less dangerous clothes in post-Matanza El Salvador. Come here, girl, they called to Anita one day, like a queen calling to her subjects to court. Let me look at you. What do you want? I'd like a beautiful dress, one that will make me look like a princess. Okay, let's have a look at what miracles you want me to perform, they joked. They possessed a preternatural mathematical ability to determine the measurements of her clients on site, as she did with Anita now. Then they went to her machine and pushing the pedal slowly, began her work. They had learned to sew as a girl. Throughout the boom and bust of the early 20th century, they slowed the time of the fast-paced city with her most cherished possession, her Singer sewing machine. The pin attached to the pedal pushed and pulled the treadle wheel, which squeaked every few revolutions. The squeaks a reminder of her own revoluciones. They had a way with people. Her manner and work gave her a deep understanding of the lives of the prostitutes and others of the working poor, and the many abuses they suffered, the daily working of their kids and family relations, and their attitudes towards their bodies. They used this information to tailor her creations to those who visited her shop. I got the golondrina from some asshole, Anita told Tay, and then I passed it on to Raul. Now Ramon and the other guys are making fun of us. Pushing the pedal as if in deep meditation, Tay responded, you might want to find another way to make money, Anita. But what would I do? This is what I know. They took her time before responding. You can work for me. What? Yes, I will teach you to sew and you can help me. Anita stood in shock. She paused for a moment and then looked at Day's smile with two missing front teeth and agreed. Are you sure? She asked Day. Yes, I've taught lots of ladies here. Let's do it. Several other women would join Anita in working for Day over the years. In addition to teaching the prostitutes her trade and having the women work for her, Day also had used her mathematical skills to save up some money and was eventually able to lend money at a flexible rate. Like Anita, many of her clients went home not just with a new dress, but with something more valuable, a different story, a different mythology about themselves, and those contained in the terms like India, puta, hijueputa, and pandillero, gang. In her time with Thea at her Singer, Anita once again became the young country girl who played in the redolent almond groves, the little girl who dreamed of being a pipil princesa, who had been forgotten behind the puta label and all that civilized society heaped upon her kind.
I love this chapter. Well, once because this period is so interesting for women in Latin America, but particularly in Central America, right? You know, in El Salvador and most of Central America during this period, and actually till now, over 60% of the population are informal workers, right? So women who sew, sex workers, people who sell vendedoras ambulantes, right? People who sell food and things like that. So it just seems so, it just comes alive, you know, for me. And also my tocaya, right? Anita Villeda, we might have been family members. I don't know, you know. I'm interested in figuring out from you, and then we'll turn it over to questions because my students have many questions and I don't want to take too much time. Figuring out from you how the story of Anita, like how was that shared in your family? Number one, like how did that story come alive for you in that way? And then two, you know, how did the story of, how is the story of the Matanza transferred in family, right? Between family members, because I've heard stories of the 1969 Guerra del Fútbol y toda esa onda, but I haven't heard, because most of the survivors are dead. So how does this come alive for you? And why is it important to tell this story from the perspective of Mama Tay and Anita Villada?
Wow, that's a massive question there, my dear. So let me take it like you have to eat the elephant piece by piece. First part is how did I come about to the story? Firstly, I heard some of these stories from my abuelita, Mama Te, right? I would be sitting on her lap and she'd be sewing and, an electric sewing machine, no longer an iron sewing machine. And she would tell stories to the kids about my dad's upbringing. My dad would share some of these stories. And when I decided to write the book, I started doing intensive interviews of my father, who detailed a lot of this for me, which is, oral history, what's called oral history. I just did it because he's my dad and I had a recorder. It's not that complicated, oral history, right? There are techniques you have to use and, try to get at things. But so I first encountered these things through family stories, which is a lot of where I think our politics start, our values, or the values we want to reject, because not everything that our parents transmit to us is desirable, as in the case of, say, some fascistic values that some families, in fact, do have in the Salvadoreño case, or even now where you have, say, a lot of evangelical families that are pro-Trump, and a lot of young people are struggling. Damn, are my parents fascists? Maybe, maybe not. So, uh, so that's how I came to it, and um, La Matanza was actually came through the silences, right? La Matanza, again, is one of the most violent episodes in history, as far as the number of people killed per day per week. And I had no clue about it as a kid, except to hear these little whispers about some dude named El General. And my family would talk about El General, or I would hear these little stories about, or these phrases. And this is why, sometimes it's just the phrases and the silences. I would hear these phrases of cuando mataron a los comunistas, right? These phrases that your family puts out, they're kind of like almost a reproduction of propaganda of the state. Like psychologists like R.D. Laing will tell you that the first place where the state meets you in your intimate life is your family oftentimes, right? Your family subconsciously transmits values that you may or may not want. And sometimes growing up is kind of like trying to sort through the things that you want, the things that are a lie, the things that are, and so La Matanza was one of those things that was there in the silence, but it was never there in like a conceptual way. There was no book like this or the other books written by historians like Perez Brignoli and Aldo Lauria and other scholars. Um, so Jeff Gould, and so I I came to La Matanza through the silences and through the little things, and I would actually say through my own feeling of what the poet Roque Dalton called half deadness. Roque Dalton said in the guerrilla poet, one of the greatest poets in America Latina, en El Salvador, said that todos nacimos medio muertos en 1932. We were all born half dead. And when I heard that phrase as a kid from my cousins who were sharing this secret poetry with me right before El Salvador blows up into the war. They were like death squad operatives next door to my primos. And so, we had to read poetry or listen to it, music, protest music in secret, in the silences, in the corners, right? And so that phrase, todos nacimos medio muertos, stood with me, even though I didn't understand most of the poem because I was a kid and I was kind of a dumbass, quite frankly. So, um, you know, uh, but I did, that phrase spoke to me because I did feel half dead in all that rage and anger that I had that was molten inside of me, como un volcán. And it eventually led me to rebel. And so that 1932, later on, I understood what it meant. And so La Matanza comes as as an act of unforgetting, because most of the records, most of the stories, most of the people who experienced it are dead or buried, are buried. The truths are buried. And so we have to reconstruct memory in order so that we, like the Jews, in the case of the Holocaust and the violence against Jews, can reconstitute ourselves for justice, but also for healing, right? Because you may not have lived through 1932, but I can tell you, when I find out my family's relationship to La Matanza, I realized why I was so crazy that I joined like a clique. I was violent. I robbed people. I beat up people. I stole cars. I dealt drugs. I didn't know why I did that or why I joined the FMLN. I just knew I was kind of a crazy dude. But eventually I realized I was carrying an atom bomb of trauma. So I think it's important to answer your last question for personal reasons to be aware of the history with a big H and connect it to history with a small h, which is the history that you carry. Each of us is part of history, as I'm sure you teach your students, Suyapa. We're all carriers of history. We're all actors in history, which means we can change history, which is really the main point for unforgetting the past.
Thank you for that. I know my students have a lot of questions, and so I'm going to ask students to ask your questions. You can keep your screen off. I'm going to just so we're recording, so if you don't want to be seen in screen, you may turn your camera off. But I want to turn it over to students now. Who would like to go first? And then we're going to popcorn. So whoever asks a question gets an answer. We'll get to choose the next person. Who would like to go first? Otherwise, I'm gonna pick someone. How about Susie?
You said Susie? Sure, let me pull out my questions just a second.
Hello, Susie.
I think one of my first questions was around self-care. Just, I know that you heard a lot of traumatizing stories and were witnessed and exposed, and I was just wanting to know more or less what your wellness and self-care practices have been throughout and how they've evolved over time. That's one of my questions.
Wow, what an excellent and thoughtful question, Susie. Thank you. I can't answer it without a PhD thesis, but let me try to answer it a little bit. My first, I mean, it's a history, and it does change over time. My initial self-care is basically getting pissed off and fighting for social justice, which was not the best self-care. I gave more anger to Ronald Reagan, the president of the United States, responsible for a lot of mass murder of Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, Brazilians, Argentinians, and others. I never gave anybody that kind of anger like I did. And he was like the father of my political anger, I could say. Kind of like, for many, I guess in your generation, it's Donald Trump. You know, but I would argue that that was not entirely well placed. I have a lot of anger for Barack Obama, the first president to cage Central American children by the thousands, the first to separate thousands of Central American families. So I had to learn to manage my anger initially, and this didn't come till after the war. So I was just kind of an intense dude during the war and shortly after. And then I eventually used all the energy I had for revolutionary stuff and started bringing it back on myself. Started reading about psychology. There's a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, which was an interesting book by Alice Miller. I started reading R.D. Laing, The Politics of the Family. I started seeing therapists to deal with war trauma. And I had a therapist who gave me a book called, and I mentioned it in the book, it's called The Memorial Candle, Dina Ciardi. And that book talked about, the scholars studied the survivors of Holocaust families, the families that survived the Holocaust or that are the children of the Holocaust. And inevitably among these families, there was often one child in the family who would before the darkness and the silence, because anytime there's a massive genocide like that, there's silence. And in the case of Salvadoreños, it's similar, or Guatemaltecos or other peoples, Mexican, there's a lot of trauma in our lives. And so that I learned that I was that person in my family, the child that wanted to uncover the dark. I didn't know why, but and that led me on a whole nother journey of self-care. That was the recuperation of memory, personal memory, family memory. Why doesn't my father have any pictures of his father, brothers, or anybody from his family in the living room? Whereas my mom's family are like coloring all the walls, like, parrots on the walls or something, just beautiful tropical colors. So the journey of memory is a very healing process. You have to, as the psychologist Carl Jung says, you have to find the gold in the dark. The gold is in the dark. There's no way around it. And as you young people are looking at a very difficult future where there aren't going to be, for example, I was reading this morning, any koala bears after 2050 if we continue the path that we're on, right? You're going to have to need some heavy duty spiritual stuff. So taking care of the body, I learned along the way, fasting, social sharing stories, being part of groups, and really the pursuit of beauty and the sublime is a very, very powerful healing thing. I look at all that I've been through, war, mass grave sites, death squads try to kill me, narco traffickers have approached me in Mexico, going to 2,500 miles of mass graves from El Salvador to Arizona, Texas, and northern Mexico. And why don't I have a bullet in my head? Well, the reason is beauty, the sublime, and the power of that, the story of my people who have survived and overcome so much, I think was an inspiration to me. And that's what I share in the book. And that's about it, what I can do to answer your question outside of what's in the book. Thank you.
Can you pick someone else?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, Susie.
Sure. Neda?
Thank you for coming to our class and talking. My question was regarding you mentioned that people who experience and survive like the massacres and genocides carry their experience in silence. So I was wondering, how do you reconnect with the past if like silence is like part of Central Americans? And when you do listen to stories, how do you respond to their stories or provide support? Because a lot of times it's very traumatic.
Excellent question. Excellent question. By the way, you're surrounded with some of my favorite colors, lavender, pink. Oh my God. So I'm totally fairly disposed to answer your question. And so my answer is very carefully. If you're going to do this work in dealing with the trauma of others, or even your own trauma, your own pain and suffering over life, and all of you do have it, you better be careful, because it's very dangerous terrain for the other and for you. So in terms of as being a journalist and a storyteller, I've learned to take, I didn't know initially, I just kind of went in like a bull and try to get the story and think I was doing right, not knowing that I was probably messing people up, quite frankly, being honest, as the kind of mistakes you make as a young journalist, as a young person sometimes. Hopefully you won't make those mistakes, but soon after though, I learned, I read up, there's books and organizations that specialize in helping journalists ask tough questions in ways that don't make people, messed up. So you have to take your time. You got to be embedded. You can't just parachute into somebody's life. Okay, all right, tell me your trauma. All right, let's find out why Susie's asking that question. Right? We have to kind of like get to know them, and over time, I think that's the best way, so that there's a trust that the person has in sharing these profound experiences with you. In my own case, before I wrote this and decided to write it, on forgetting, I knew that I was going to open up after I went to one of these quote unquote detention centers, which are really prisons. I've talked to the women and children, and they're prisons. It's bullshit to call them detention centers, quite frankly. And so I visited them when Barack Obama was caging and separating thousands of people, right? And I had been avoiding my Salvadoran history because of all the pain that I carried. And then I met a child who just told me this tragic story. If you read the book, you see what happens. And I decided, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to tell my story. So before I didn't put it in the book, but because there wasn't enough room, you can't put everything in there. So there's a few things that are kind of hacked off there that I would change now, like the story of G, my love story that's in there. People want to, hey, what happened with G? So what I learned that before I embarked on my own journey, I had to be very careful from interviewing other people. I learned that I retained the services of a therapist when I decided to tell my story. And we mapped out the terrain that I was going to be covering. And we were going to use the writing of the book in a cathartic way to help me not just tell a story outside, but heal inside. So I hope that that answers your question. Very good question, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you.
And I have a question for you.
Yes.
What's your favorite colors?
Yeah, it's
Okay, as my students would say, then we're here.
yeah. I should popcorn, right, Suyapa?
Yes, please.
Okay, off popcorn to Danny.
Hi. First of all, I really enjoyed your book. I myself grew up in the mission, so that was really cool to get all the references. And I guess I have a couple questions, but first, I guess, is about that. I think growing up in the mission, obviously, there's a very important culture there. At least for me, it really shaped how I view the world. So I guess my question for you would be, how do you think growing up in the mission and being in the Bay and moving between all these places kind of facilitated the transnational aspect of your life, and I guess also how that shaped your worldview?
Well, let me just start off by blaming a woman for the problem I hear in this question. Suyapa, why are you setting me up with all these very smart, difficult, impossible to answer questions? Okay, I'm blaming you.
Hey, they came up with these questions on their own, I promise.
I blame you, Professor, okay? So no, that's an excellent question. That how am I not gonna answer it from a fellow mission person? I'm actually here in the mission right now, at this moment, at Mission Street near the corner of 26th. I grew up on Folsom Street, about 3.5 blocks down the street from the projects, working class kid. Growing up in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, at a time when the mission was, I would say, a very magical place. And I would even argue one of the greatest neighborhoods in the United States. Because, and you can hear it, you can see it in the fact that all around me right now are still the remnants of the culture that gave birth to the most murals of any neighborhood in the world, right? There's an explosion of color on the walls of the mission because it was an explosion of this global culture that was here, that was brought from Mexico, from Central America to this neighborhood. And also, you can hear the sounds of this in the music by a guy that went to my old high school, but went when my brother Omar went. A guy whose music is loved not just in San Francisco or California, but not just the United States, but all over the world. I've been all over the world, and every time I tell somebody, yeah, man, my brother went to school with this dude who used to not go to class and just play guitar in the hallway. Oh, what was his name? Carlos Santana. So when you listen to Carlos Santana and you hear the world love Carlos Santana, it's the world loving itself. Because if you listen to Santana, you look at the murals, you see the currents of consciousness that make for great artists, right? Those of you that want to be artists have to channel the trends and the thought patterns and the feeling patterns of your moment. And so Carlos Santana took hippie culture, which was beautiful and powerful, Black power, brown power, psychedelic culture, Eastern thinking, the birth of the electronic guitar, my immigrant Mexican history, and so many other things to channel the music, to create the beautiful music that so many of us still love. So um, San Francisco's mission was magical that way. And I try to bring a little bit of that into the book because, okay, I joined the FMLN guerrillas and people sometimes tend to focus on that. And I'll be honest with you, that part of my life actually sucked up and erased for a moment within me the mission in me. And so one of the things I had to unforget was the fact that I'm from here, grew up in this neighborhood, and that I have a life here. I'm not from down south. I connect to down south umbilically through my family, through my history, through my revolutionary activity, but yo soy de aquí. And so, yeah, I think culture is a great, and where you grow up, finding the way that you're connected to the world is a beautiful and good thing. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
And I had a lowrider too,
yeah.
and a bomb. Bomb was these like old cars that were like round. So
Yeah, I only hear stories of the mission back in the day. Obviously, it's a very different place now.
yeah.
Okay, I will popcorn to Kenya.
I just want to say thank you, like everybody, for coming. First and foremost, like, I don't know, this is so amazing. I'm like furiously scribbling down everything you say on this notebook that I have. It's just, it's really, really amazing. Kind of following the theme that both Susie and Natha brought up of like healing. I guess my question to you is about the semantics of Mara. And I wrote it down, so I'm just going to read it as I wrote it, because otherwise I think I might fumble up the wording. But in exploring the semantics of Mara, I understood most of all that the US co-opted and warped more than a word for community, camaraderie, brotherhood, friendship, and care, but rather those themes themselves. In sitting with the liminal space that the Mara miembros themselves exist in, how can the leap from a brotherhood for sanctuary to a negative connotation help us understand a path, possibly retrograde, to healing and liberation for these gang members? Does this implicate unrelearning or unforgetting?
So yeah, but you're really going to hear from my lawyers when I'm done with this, okay? These are very on point questions that you set me up for. So, excellent question. Difficult to answer, but are you asking me, how can we, is it important to unlearn and unforget the ways that we've been taught to be, for example, as gang members or something, and the way we understand gangs? Is that more or less what you're getting at, Kenya?
I think so, but also like, I guess the situated knowledge that comes with like the historicized experiences of what it means to be like a miembro de una Mara, and kind of like sitting there, and how does this position help us understand like both, I don't know, like future possibilities, the past that has been, and like how do we heal from that?
Oh man, if I could figure out how we could heal from all that, I would be a rich man. I could sell the potion or the magic words. But that's unfortunately not the world we live in. It's going to take time to heal. I think my own life, I dedicated 5 years to unforgetting the book and the process, because and it was hard for me because you see in my bio, I'm an active person. I'm a person of action. I take action. And it was hard for me to justify this idea of going into 5 years of my life and writing a book and then talking about my feelings and stuff like, damn, so, but I think along the process, I've learned that, and what I try to do is show through my own story, for example, here in the mission, I belong to a little clique called Los Originales. We, like I said, we stole, we robbed, we did things that were against the law, right? And we were considered by outsiders like gang, but we didn't consider ourselves a gang. We were just a group of friends. And In El Salvador, there was a similar process where the people we would hang out with when I would visit in the summer or in the winter called themselves La Mara, because the word Mara originally meant friends. And it came from, as you read, a movie in 1953 that was with Charlton Heston. And so, I've watched as this word became an industry that the Pentagon, Lisa Ling and National Geographic, a lot of major media, think tanks of the Republican and Democratic parties, all these different interests would converge to create this idea of the deadliest gang in the world, the Maras. And you have those tattoo face images of bald dudes, which are obsolete for anybody like me who's been with the gangs. Long ago, that image was transcended. So I realized as a Salvadoreño that that's the primary image of Salvadoreños in the world. So that if we're going to rescue our humanity from the external forces that dehumanize, we're going to have to go into the gang world to humanize, find the humanity in the gangs. Not difficult to do if you spend any time. They're human beings like the rest of us. Most of the gang members aren't killers, right? I've shown that in my reporting and done interviews with police forces and whatnot. And so, so we have an external fight for the truth of our past. That's why I say unforgetting. By the way, the idea for unforgetting comes from the Greeks, the journey into the underworld, right? Because you see my book, there's a lot of underworld activity, right? Gangs, the FMLN guerrilla, the secrets of the family, the secrets of El Salvador, the secrets of the United States, immigrant prisons hidden way down in where nobody goes in South Texas. So I found this word from the Greeks that was about the journey into the underworld. It was aletheia, and it was to describe the way that when you died, you first had to go to the Lethe River. And the Lethe River was the river of forgetting. And the dead had to forget who they were in life. And so theorists of fascism, like Hannah Arendt, would say that we had to unforget in order to fight fascism, to find the truths that make the powerful uncomfortable, that afflict them. We have to afflict and make uncomfortable the powerful if we're to rescue our memories, because they are the gatekeepers of memory officially. Like when you look at La Matanza in 1932, those memories were erased by the state. Same thing happens in your families. The gatekeepers are your parents. Your mission is to get under there and get out those secrets that have you prisoner and you don't even know it, because emotionally you've inherited sometimes heavy traumas, just like the gangs have. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do in the book. Thank you for the very thoughtful question, Kenya.
Thank you. And I'm gonna popcorn to Elisa.
Hi. First, I just want to say this book was incredible. I didn't do any of my other classwork because I was just reading this book all weekend.
Yes, get those classes, yes.
Yeah, I don't know any statistics now, but it's okay. I just wanted to ask, because you talked a lot about the relationship between like you and your dad and just your family and how that changed after going to El Salvador multiple times. So I was wondering, like, have you been able to share what you've learned about yourself with your family? And did you get to share parts of the book with your family before you published it?
Absolutely. You read the book, so you see that I kind of show the dirty laundry of my dad, right? I get at some family secrets that are pretty hardcore. And so, yeah, if you're gonna do this, you better, first of all, let people know, hey, listen, so what I do with my father is, hey, listen, Pop, because that's what I call my dad, is Pop. All right, Pop, look, pero en español se lo digo porque no hablamos en inglés en mi familia. So, hey, Pop, I'm going on this journey and I'm gonna tell some of your story, and quite frankly, I'm gonna tell the truth about you. So you may not look in the most ideal way sometimes, but it's gonna be true in all your different aspects, in the beautiful and the powerful and the charismatic and the love that you have, but also this other stuff, the violent and whatnot. He understood and he was okay with it. I wouldn't have done it if he wasn't okay with it. or I would have to do it another way maybe. So I let my rest of my family know as well, because people could get pissed off and say, hey man, why are you talking about pop like that? Because those are the things that prevent us in our families from getting at the truths that hold us prisoner often, is the peer pressure. And so I was the youngest in my family. There's 7 years between me and my nearest sibling. So I was born to rebel. I was a crazy mug from the beginning. And so kind of like, and I was my mom's son. My mom's a very powerful person. She's going to be one of the subjects of my next book. This book's about fathers and sons, a lot of ways, right? Because of the nature of the violence, and it's a very masculine enterprise. World violence is, right? So, yeah, I did share with my family, and and what was the second part of your question?
I think it was like, were you able to share with them like about what you learned about yourself? Because I know in the part you talked about.
Oh, yeah. Oh, great question. Because yeah, I'm the one who would dive in and look at the family secrets. I was the memorial candle in my family, shining on light into the darkness. So like my brothers, my sister not so much, but my brothers would sometimes like look over my shoulder and ask me, hey man, what did you find out? What did you find out about Pop? Like nobody knew stuff about my dad and his history. And my brothers, I think, knew instinctively that some of those secrets that I had explained in part who my brothers are and why they feel half dead, right? You found out what about Pop? Whoa, really? I mean, I also found really inspiring stuff like, you see my dad built this contrabando empire, right? From El Salvador and I thought, wow, man, Pop really thought it through and really built a transnational network. But in fact, it wasn't him, it was my abuelita, Mama Teje, and my abuelita was a badass. And I didn't know how bad, I knew she was loving, that she made pupusas, that she was funny, that she brought us here, that she was a powerful person, but I didn't know that she had built this network, not on airplanes, but on ships. That she even got my dad to teach her how to use a 38 special so that when the crooks try to rip her off, she would shoot at them. It's like, damn, and to find out these incredible stories of the women and the men in my family was empowering. I found guerrilleras in my family who I didn't know about. Women who were rich on my father's side. They're not in the book, but I found out they were guerrilleras, and they were like, whoa, they're kind of badass. And that influenced me when I made my decision to join the guerrilla. So yeah, there's a lot of goodness, and it's difficult work, but it pays off in the course of your lives. And I strongly encourage you to get under the histories of your families, just like you get under the histories of your nations. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll popcorn to Aranza.
Hi, good afternoon. Just before my question, I wanted to say thank you so much for being here with us and for sharing these experiences with our little collective. And my question would be, I heard you mention how you looked towards like a therapist to help you plan out like how you wanted to write this memoir, and I just want to hear a little bit more about the writing process, because I know that a lot of these experiences are very traumatic, and the actual act of writing them out could maybe be like a sort of way to relive these experiences. So I wanted to know if maybe there were any moments in which you found it to be very difficult to share these stories, or if there were any moments in which you doubted if you were ready to have these stories shared.
Wow, well, I'm going to be a rich man at the end of this session here because my lawyers are going to get a lot of money out of Suyapa. So this is very traumatic for me, these difficult questions. So, no, I'm kidding. It's a great, great question. I mean, I mapped out the book on at two levels, right? There's the emotional mapping and there's the literary mapping. How am I going to tell the story? So I'm going to talk a little bit about both, if I may. The emotional mapping was, figuring out what I could go into and not want to blow my brains out? Right? How far can I go in the dark without hurting myself? It's a critical question that anybody dealing with a traumatic experience is going to have to ask themselves. Fortunately, again, I'm my mom's son, and my mom taught me to be courageous. If you read the book, you see my mom talking to me at the beginning of the book about facing death. My mom taught me how to face death. One of the most difficult things I did was actually face death with my mom when in 2013, my mom was dying. And nobody in the family wanted to tell my mom she was dying in the hospital. So being my mom's son and knowing my mom would want to know if she was dying. And I went and I told my mother, looked her in the bed, told her, mamá, con todo el dolor del alma, le tengo que decir que los doctores dicen que va a morir usted. Just imagine how difficult that is. One of the most difficult things. But that was the necessary work to look at the abyss, at the most difficult things that there are in life. That's what my mother taught me. And so I was equipped, I was well trained to then dive in to the past that way. And I got help from the therapist, and we looked at different parts of my life, some of which I had already worked through, other ones that needed some work, and we mapped it out little by little. And then I started mapping out how I was going to tell the story, and I realized that, like, anytime you write a memoir, which is a genre, right, you're making a comment on the nature of memory. We're going back to Suyapa's question about historical memory. So I wanted to make a comment about, like, the fragmented nature of memory itself. You don't think of your memory like first this, then that, then that. Like, I can tell you right now, hey, what's the story behind that lotion on your drawer, right? What's the story there? It's going to take you back. You're going to have to go back and tell the story, and we're going to interrupt the flow of progress, quote unquote, in this. And so, and I also wanted the reader to share at least some of the experience of what it was like to lead a life like what I led, with the kind of little clique violence and criminal stuff, the struggles with my father and the rebellion, joining the guerrillas. What made me do this, I didn't know until later on, as you read in the book. And so how do I bring the reader on that journey with me without, I had to break up time, right? I had to leave the past hidden for a while until, boom, you find out my dad's story. I don't know if any of you read that part of the book and you were like, excuse my language, fuck, that's heavy, right? I mean, that's how I experienced it, but even deeper, I cried with my father. I was like, whoa. And so, you know, the Mayans and other cultures believe that time is cyclical, that patterns reproduce themselves. And that's a whole different philosophy and a way to look at time and memory. And so I try to weave that into the book. Like, you see the story of the underworld journey of the Nahuatl peoples. It's a small section, but I tell the story of the way that the Nahuatl believed that the bones and body parts of the dead in the underworld would actually speak and joke and work and do things in life, which is a very different from the kind of Christian burial and approach to death. And so these are the different ways that I try to weave those two between my personal journey and the narrative journey that I took. I hope that kind of answers your question. And you can tell me about that lotion later.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Varun.
Hey, Roberto. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. I too really enjoyed your book. And I also am a fellow Bay Area native, so great to see you.
What neighborhood?
Sorry?
What neighborhood?
I'm in Los Altos. I'm not in San Francisco.
Okay.
So I'm closer to San Jose.
San Jose. We used to go low riding down there.
Definitely. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned towards the end of your book that about your time as a professor at CSU Northridge, when you kind of taught your students about your experiences and your family's experience, and how they were in general really upset at the treatment of gangs by the United States, specifically the media, and how they kind of wanted more representation for minority voices who were just peaceful and not portrayed as the news media portrays gangs. And based on that, my question is, like, what can Americans who are kind of have this fear whenever the word gang is mentioned and have this negative connotation in their minds towards gangs, what can Americans understand? What should we understand about suppressed groups in Central America and in El Salvador that would kind of flip the switch on that negative connotation we have? Sorry, I had trouble wording it there, but what can we kind of understand? What would you like us to understand? Thank you.
Great question, and congratulations on being the first dude that I've seen in Suyapa's class. So actually, by the way, I don't know if you know, but I have to share some serious gossip about your professor, if I may, before. She was a professor at Northridge, too, unbeknownst to many. But we'll not talk about that till after the session. But so how, I don't use the word Americans, as you know from my book, right? I use it in quotes, unless there's an accent on the E and it says America, right? Because that's the origin of the term. It's, this country stole the name of the continent for itself. It bordered off itself from the rest of the continent. And that's kind of what informs the ideology and the thinking of people that are American in many ways. It's a bordered consciousness that looks at immigration through the screen of the border, right? The screen cuts off right there at the US-Mexico border or at Canada, so that you get the story of immigration on the screen, and it completely eliminates the history of US policy, the destruction of the South. So, yeah. So when I try to answer the question in my book, I don't talk about gangs from talk about police, talk about military, talk about US policy. You can't, because the ideas of gangs are manufactured by these interests, as I show. The training of the police, for example, you look at the part where I talk about US military trainers trained the people that killed 75 to 80,000, most of the 75 to 80,000 people, right? The death squads and the Atlacat battalion, the military, the military that would slaughter like 1,000 people in a matter of hours. Half of them were children under 12, and half of those children were under 6. So that's why, people ask me, why do you join the guerrillas? Well, I wanted to fight fascism, right? Fascism killed hundreds of children in hours. There's no question. So, and that was a Republican and a Democratic Party project. So those trainers that trained those killers, after the war, I show how they came and they trained who? LAPD, New York Police, NYPD, and other police departments, and what scholars like Stuart Schrader, who I strongly recommend you read, call counterinsurgency policing, right? They start seeing our population not as a community, but as an insurgency that needs to be policed. So that's what Black Lives Matter is fighting right now. And the person that helped bring that about in a stronger way with reference to gangs is a guy named Bill Barr, as you saw in my book, who was the Attorney General under the first Bush that deployed all these FBI agents, 300 of them, in the largest single deployment of FBI resources in US history at the time, to start the war on gangs. And then Bill Barr's Immigration Service joins the Bill Barr's Immigration Service, the INS, before there was a Homeland Security, deported with the LAPD the gangs to El Salvador. So, and then they exported US-style policing, which is then what we have now in El Salvador and the US. We have the same kind of policing that Black Lives Matter right now is trying to fight and abolish. So, that story I just told you that's in the book shows what I call the circuits of counterinsurgency policing, and the way that you can't separate the gangs from the policing that helps frame them, that pushes them to be more violent, that kills them, that the gangs say, and I recognize this in my own life. The gangs would tell me, well, you treat me like a dog, I'm gonna become a wolf. I didn't have that saying, but that's what I felt as a kid. And I didn't you wanna call me a wolf? Well, I was a revolutionary wolf. I rebelled against the state and a fascist military dictatorship. That's what they don't want. So the whole gang scare thing is a lie. An epic, massive lie used as an excuse to deploy police in the lives of communities they want to control. And you have this stuff about that we've already talked about in terms of the humanity of Salvadorans and gangs. It's been lost in all these stories, right?
Thank you so much. Thanks for those great questions. I know we didn't get to our extensive list of questions, but we want to give the author some time to rest before our next installment, part 3, in Professor Gilda Ochoa's class. So, yes.
If you want to ask 1 or 2 more questions, we can do it.
Okay, so 1 or 2. Varun, do you want to choose popcorn to someone?
Yeah, I will send it off to Leslie.
Hello. Thanks again for coming and just being here with us in our class. It's so nice to be able to read the book and ask, the author you questions personally. So my question is about mano dura and Trump's kind of obsession for calling for law and order in his administration. And to this, I want to ask, how do we as students call for change while those in power continuously threaten to use force? How do we as students get involved in grassroots community protests and all, while those in power are continuously just using force, because it feels a bit hopeless to be calling out for peaceful protesting.
Okay, the first thing I'm going to do with your lovely question, the question of the moment, question of history, the question of we all have to be asking ourselves in a world that mass produces hopelessness. So the first thing I need to tell you is what I've learned in 30 years of struggle, revolutionary struggle and other struggle in immigrant rights against police and whatnot, is that hopelessness is not born from within. There's people outside of us in the media, in the Pentagon, in the policing structures, even in the scholarly world. I mean, there's some reactionary people, I'm sure you know, at Pitzer. Claremont Colleges has some right-wing fascists in there, what's the name of that think tank? I forget, so Yapa can put that in the chat, but they're right-wing. And so it's media, academia, politicians, and many other ones.
Oh, which one are you thinking about? The Latino one?
No, there's a right-wing
the Claremont Independent.
I forget. Let's do the research on that. I don't want to lose track. And so, these are all in the industry of mass producing hopelessness. So when you feel hopelessness, know that Donald Trump, the corporations and the military, whose job it is to do that. Because my friends who are guerrilla commanders, comandantes guerrilleros, who were some of the fiercest, baddest ass fighters I've ever met in my life, who were considered one of the most effective people's movements by the Central Intelligence Agency and other national security agencies, were trained by the Vietnamese generals who were 5 feet tall and defeated the most powerful country on earth And they also defeated the French and other imperial forces. And so the training, and my friends, I would ask them, what did you learn? What's the Jedi knowledge of revolutionary thought, right? He says, well, my friend, he's a bookish type. He says, well, the Jedi knowledge is that war and politics are primarily spiritual acts, psychological. And so you have to, war and politics have to do with the animo, the psychology of your adversary, the psychology of the people between you and your adversary, the population, and the spirit of your troops, of your people, of your side. And so any national security operative knows this at the top levels of government and media and everything else. And their job is to pump hopelessness into the culture so that you believe there's no hope. So that said, in terms of how do we fight that, you continue the struggle even when it seems hopeless, first of all. It's never hopeless. If you've allowed yourself to be hopeless, know that you are a victim of the machinery of hopelessness that is government, that is the corporate media, that is corporate power in the world. They are not our friends. And so I think you all know that in your hearts. You want to hope for something, but there's not a lot given to you out there right now to grab onto to have hope. So you got to create it yourself. You got to read history. That's why I wrote this, right? Look at all that I've been through. War. Death squads tried to kill me. They killed friends of mine. Mass grave sites. Stunning exploitation of people across 2,500 miles. Mass grave sites in Mexico and the United States. So you might ask yourself, why doesn't this dude have a bullet in his head? Right? Well, because I learned to fight. I learned to fight here and here. Right? And if you learn to fight here and here, that's the first location of battle. Eventually you become kind of fearless in terms of you have the fear and you do what you want to do anyway, and you become really dangerous to the system. So if you want to be dangerous to the system, find that source of power within yourself that can't be lost, that can't be defeated. Okay? Eso es lo mejorcito que yo tengo. It was what was taught to me. And it's what allowed me to go through the journey of all the heavy things that I went through in this book. And so the police, the police are shaking in their boots right now because never in the history of the United States has anybody called for the abolition of the police, for the abolition of prisons. I see that and I'm like, because I never saw that in my lifetime. You're seeing it as if it was normal. So I hope that begins to answer your very beautiful question, Leslie.
Thank you so much. It's so instrumental. Thank you.
I think we can do one more, right, Lovato?
Yeah.
Okay, so Leslie put one more person and then we're going to wrap it up.
Did Kai go? Kai Dorsey?
No, I didn't. Hi. Thank you for coming. I really loved reading your book, and I liked the portion that was assigned to me and learning about Central American history because I really do not know anything, and I feel like my education has truly left out a big portion of history. So my question is, why were you compelled to show the human side of gangsters? Gangsters are obviously always dehumanized because of the violent stereotypes associated with their lifestyle. And my further question is, do you think it's important to break that stereotype, especially when looking at the Latinx community?
What do you think?
What do I think that there's always more than one side to a narrative. So
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to do, is show the other side. I wasn't even trying to, I didn't feel compelled really. I'm just telling a true story. It's and true and beautiful. That's what my job as a writer is, to tell something that's true and beautiful as possible. I don't know if it's beautiful. I try to make it beautiful. And so, you know, remember the image of the gangs is the dominant image of Salvadorans and Central Americans by and large in the world. So you either live with that and you allow others to define you, or you go in and you bring out deeper truths than the superficial things that are on the surface. That's why I think the underworld is an important journey in different ways, metaphoric, mythological, literary. And so, you know, Zoom, you go, you know, you have all this fake news, not just among Donald Trump, but actually in liberal media about the gangs, right? There's like, you know, I mean, you have the media not telling you that caging thousands of Central American children began with Barack Obama. Concentration camps for thousands of Central American immigrants began with Barack Obama. You know, the media is suddenly telling you in 2018, Donald Trump is evil, basically, for caging and concentrating and separating Central American children, which Obama also did on a massive scale. It was the first one that did it on a mass scale. So, you know, we have a system that's bipartisan that creates these myths and lies, and they're superficial. So you have to go under to get at the deeper truth. So that's what I wanted to do. That's what I think what our journey began on in this conversation with Suyapa's question about memoria histórica, historical memory, the work of bringing out memory in the name of justice, right? And so, and I encourage you all right now, if, you know, Padre, Hijo, Espíritu Santo, let us hope Donald Trump is destroyed in the elections and that he becomes a prisoner for crimes against humanity. Okay, let us pray if we pray for that. But regardless of the outcome, we're going to have to deal with the difficult truths about the Democratic Party. And are we going to allow Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to give a friendly face to the continued practice of Obama and Trump of caging, concentrating, and separating Central American and other children and mothers by the thousands? I challenge your generation to say, hell no. Hell no. That's inhuman. That's fascist. I don't care what party does it. It's fascist. So my motives, I think, are clear, I hope, in what I write in the book. Really, it's really because, again, you got to go, like Jung says, the gold is in the dark. You got to go down under into the darkness, into the silences, and you'll find, you know, the gold and the diamond and the bright shining pieces of stars that are up against the background of the darkness, like what I write about, right? That's was my attempt, was to use the dark background of my history and of what I've seen to show the powerful, beautiful, magnificent things about Salvadorans and others.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I know we're at time at 2 o'clock. So this portion is over. I don't know, Roberto, if you want to stay a few minutes. In this class, we have a tradition where we stay an extra few minutes to kind of, you know, people have some burning questions. I'm getting private messages here. So
what time is our next session here?
At 2:30, if you can stay an extra 5 minutes, whoever
okay,
needs
an extra 5 minutes, but without big questions, so we just hang out.
I think you have some big questions coming. So whoever needs to go, thank you for being here. We'll see you at 2:30, same link, same passcode. Thank you everybody for coming and asking really excellent questions.
Oh, there were really excellent questions, Suyapa. Really, I compliment you as a teacher to have such, you know, to inspire such intelligent and informed questions. And I mean that. And if you were dumbasses, I would tell you.
I didn't do anything. These all came from students. They read and asked the questions. So we have Susie, we have Roberto for another 5 minutes. and then we're gonna close this. So.
Okay. Thank you all. See you all at 2:30. Bye-bye.
Bye. Susie, you had a burning question. I don't know anybody that didn't get to ask a question. This is your 5 minutes.
Comment is welcome too.
I specifically wanted to ask, yeah.
Go ahead.
I specifically wanted to ask you in regards to like how you feel your being male or having male privilege shaped what you chose to share and how you chose to share in your book.
Yeah, good question. I decided, you know, you try to figure out what is the story about? And I realized that what the story is about, one of the things it's about is mainly is fathers and sons and violence. And so I didn't think about my male privilege. I thought more about what do I know? What can I talk about in an informed way? So I can talk about it in an informed way about fathers and sons, and the sons who rebel by joining little groups like Los Originales that I was a part of, using that access to my heart and my experience to then bring the reader in the journey where I'm looking at the gangs through the lens of my own past. No soy un gringo, clase media alta, una gringa, rica, that's talking about the gangs. I'm a young US born Salvadoran kid. The gangs were born in LA, right here in California. And so I wanted to bring the reader into that world with my male dude self that I am, working class. And, you know, that's why I decided to make my next book about my mom, right? To tell a story of, it's gonna be a book about this bird, the scarlet macaw. I don't know if you know that bird. It's like a walking, talking, flying rainbow of a parrot.
I've
Right,
heard
you
of
see it all on, you know, in Latin American stuff, even the stuff here where they try to, it's almost a symbol of the tropical.
Yeah.
I try to rescue that image because it's a beautiful bird in reality. And when my mom died, I found solace and power in that bird. So I'm going to tell the story of the scarlet macaw and of my mom having that walking, talking, flying rainbow energy that you get a little bit of at the beginning of the book, like when I'm going into the catacombs or my mom's talking to me about death and stuff. So yeah, I try to use my male privilege to tell about male story, like that often gets forgotten in our stories of our community. So good question.
You know, I'm gonna wrap it up just because I am recording.
Gracias. Yes.
I'm gonna stop the recording now.